All right. Good afternoon, folks, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Maggie Angel. I am with the Duwamish River Community Coalition. And today we have our pre-roundtable meeting. So excited to have you guys here in this afternoon. I know many of you are getting out of work or are just getting home. So we hope that we reach you at a good time. If not, this recording will stay posted on Facebook and eventually also on our website in case you want to review it. Today we're here with a couple staff and some guests talking about the EPA roundtable meeting coming up in March 31st. So our hopes today is to answer many of your questions, to hopefully review some content, review some information that has been in the past and currently what's happening. So before I talk more, I guess I'll go ahead and introduce who we have in the room. Again, my name is Maggie, and I'll go ahead and introduce James. Hi, James, how are you?
Uh, Good afternoon, Maggie. I'm James Rasmussen. I am the Superfund Manager for the Duwamish River Community Coalition.
Welcome, James. Lynn, would you like to introduce yourself really quickly?
Yes, thank you. My name is Lynn Gould. I'm from IRDA Environmental, and I'm a technical consultant for the DRCC.
Thank you, Lynn. And last but not least, we also have our executive director here, Paulina Lopez. Would you like to introduce yourself and say hi?
Hello, of course. Good afternoon, beautiful community and friends and family, DRCC, friends and family. My name is Paulina Lopez. I go by she, her, and very excited today to go over some of the pre-roundtable documents that we have so we can discuss and have informed questions for the EPA roundtable meeting. Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you, Paulina. All right, well, should we get started, team? I know we have a tight schedule for today, and I'm sure folks back at home would like to enjoy some time with family. So let's go ahead and start with what we have for today. If you have any questions, any comments as we are going through this presentation, please feel free to leave any comments, questions, concerns down at the chat or the comment section on Facebook. If your question or comment is a little more personalized and you want to be able to speak with someone, we will also list our emails down in the comments so you could easily reach us. And now let me try to share. Please let me know if you can see my screen.
Yep, we can see it perfectly.
Perfect. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll go ahead and pass over the mic to Paulina.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you very much. So we are here, as I said, because we want to make sure that we go over some of the agenda items that we will be discussing in the roundtable. So the roundtable, just to give a little background information, it's hosted by EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency. And where they invited, you see this slide, we try to synthesize and show who is part of these roundtable meetings. So you can see, of course, the organizer is the Environmental Protection Agency, but they have a representation from the government, of the possible responsible parties, of the Duwamish River cleanup. There's community representation. There are the fishing community that are also part of it, et cetera, et cetera. You can see all these. And the main thing here is that when we as a community organization, we wanted a space where all the different stakeholders of the community, of the cleanup of the river, would have an opportunity to have a dialogue, to learn together, but also to help shape on the river cleanup and share the updates. Next slide, Maggie. So the meeting is happening on the 31st. But we always, every time there is a roundtable meeting, we want to go over the different agenda items, because we know that for years we've been requesting to have a little more interactive and less technical, and it's been a little hard not to go over the technical aspects in the EPA. So we like having a little debrief prior to the meeting. So today, for example, we know that we will be covering the overview of the Superfund process. For that is important to understand the context and why are we going to be talking about the last meeting, because everything is going to be relating, for example, on the testing on the river. But why are we doing testing? It's important to remind ourselves. So we will be going over with James and Lynn about this, and hopefully it will be a good friendly refresher for all of us to go and ask informed questions at the meeting. Also, we're going to be covering, of course, March 31st and what are our updates and hopes for that day. Next. Well, I covered these a little bit, so we can go ahead and skip it, Maggie. But the important thing as a reminder too, that I wanted to mention as an organization, so the Duwamish River Community Coalition organization was called in this past year. We've been working hard in a triple threat campaign because we recognize that there are three very important things happening at the state of the river. One was the cleanup for the Jorgensen Forge, which, by the way, it will be comment deadline coming up soon. Also, there was a change on the decisions for the explanation for significance difference on the levels of CPAHs, which is one of the main contaminants for the river. And then we have also updates on the East Waterway, which is one of another Superfund site declared by EPA, but is part of our same river. So we wanted to remind that we're still seeing the three, even though we have some wins, and we will go over in more detail. Next. So for the Jorgensen Forge, we've been having a specific meetings about this, and if you want to go in detail, please look in our website. We have updated videos, slides, and translated materials as well about the levels of, in general, about what happened to the Jorgensen Forge, but most importantly, about what are some of our asks as community, because we were listening to community, that how are we going to be preparing all these comments, which are very important for community to be aware. So this is Jorgensen Forge, for those of you who don't know, it's in the 14th Avenue Street Bridge, and it's a former steel and aluminum distribution facility that has been contaminated for years. After we had the decision EPA saying that we will fully clean up as respecting communities' desires, we heard that there was a consideration to leave some PCBs behind, and PCBs are the toxic metals. So we did not want this to happen, and we were working with community alongside as we know, we want fully removal of that as an alternative, which was not presented. Next slide, Maggie. But the good thing is, after some of those comment letters that we submitted, a new report came out addressing our concerns. And then EPA, we wanted to give the update that we'll issue a new report soon that the community needs to comment. But most importantly, I think right now we have the opportunity to say that we want another alternative, which calls for a full cleanup. And so we have more information about those specific comments in the website. It's hard to cover them all here, but it's important that we know that we are looking into these and working alongside with EPA and community. Next. And now what is happening with the levels of increased levels of CPAHs. So again, we have continued to meet with elected officials, and even though it has been a very busy time, next slide, Maggie, we're happy to also report that the CPAHs cleanup will stay the same, because EPA and responsible parties decided to stick to the record of decision. This was in jeopardy of being changed to lower levels, and we're here to community, and we advocated alongside to say, no, you committed to what you committed, and we need to respect that. So that is an update on that, and we will have more information coming up. Next slide. And then we have the East Waterway. So these waterways, as I said, is a different Superfund sites, and it was called by EPA, but on the same Duwamish River. And we know that EPA is going to release a proposed plan, cleanup plan. We have not seen it yet. Next slide. But we know that it impacts in a big way to especially our fishing community. Next slide, Maggie. What we want is to make sure that we are respecting, as we advocated for the Duwamish River Superfund, that the decisions that are going to be taken for this waterway is not jeopardizing the health of our fish, the health of our fishers, and in general of our community. So we wrote some letters to elected officials. Most importantly, we wrote a joint letter with Earth Justice stating all our different concerns that we had and asking for importantly community consultation, because we think that the pollution in the Duwamish River will be unsafe if they are allowed for more PCBs, arsenic, CPAHs, etc. So we want to make sure that this is not impacting in a way that is going to make our river unhealthier. We're still, next slide, we are still waiting for to hear back from EPA. We haven't heard after we wrote a letter, and I just wanted to say that information about all our letter is at the DRCC.org. We continue to demand EPA the 3 C's, the campaign that we call. Consultation is very important with the impacted communities, including the people that live on the valley, the tribes that represent, the fishers, and do what we call meaningful community engagement. To keep it consistent as well, so that is the second C, and the same standards as the lower Duwamish cleanup, and concurrence, which means following Washington State health protective regulations. We don't want to see any more sacrifice zones, and definitely not in the waterway. We know it's going to impact our river that we've been asking and we've been waiting so patiently for the past 20 years to be clean. So these is a little brief summary about what we've been up to as far as the DRCC. Next slide. Now we're going to transition into the Earth Justice letter that I mentioned, that we are waiting for a response. But please, if you have some additional comments or questions on our letter, the full letter, which is 120 pages, it was a lot of work. We have not received any meaningful response, so we're still waiting for that. Next slide. So now we're gonna transition to what is it that we're gonna be talking about in the roundtable meeting, and James is gonna walk us through this process together with Lynn. So James, please.
Actually, I think it's me next. Thank you, Paulina. Okay, so first I'm going to go over a little bit of the Superfund process because it's going to be easier to understand what James is talking about if I just do a little review. So the Superfund process starts right down in the bottom left-hand corner on the river called PASI, and that just really means it's a preliminary assessment and a site investigation. And that's what was done in the Duwamish back in the late 1990s. And then in where the next part is the NPL listing process, that's National Priorities Listing Process. That was 2001 when the site became a Superfund site. And then the RIFS stands for Remedial Investigation Feasibility Study. And that means that remedial investigation means that they studied like which chemicals are in the site and where they're located and how contaminated they are. And then a feasibility FS study means kind of looking for alternatives, trying to figure out how you're going to do the cleanup. Next slide, please. So there's 3 major parts of the cleanup process of the river, and one was to do early action area cleanup. So there were some areas on the river that were so contaminated that the EPA figured out if they cleaned up those early action areas first, they could clean up 50% of the risk of the contamination pollution risk to people and ecology. And then the EPA is in charge of cleaning up all the mud in the bottom of the river, but the Department of Ecology is responsible for this word called source control. And what that really means is, how do you prevent the river from being recontaminated? So how do you, there's 20,000 acres of land around the river, and you have to make sure that that contamination or pollution won't reach the river. Next slide, please. So in 2014, the ROD, Record of Decision, or the cleanup plan, was released. And that is just really the plan to decide what the method or the ways that you're going to clean up the river. And one of the things that came out of the Record of Decision was this term called Remedial Action Levels, or RALs, which I'm going to explain in the next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, what are they? Well, they are chemical levels in the mud that the cleanup plan uses to decide where to clean up and how deep to clean up and how much to clean up. So let me give you an example. Let's say you have a RAL for PCBs of 7 milligrams per kilogram, but let's just imagine 7. And if you sample the mud and it's greater than 7, then you've got to take action. But if it's less than 7, then you don't have to take action. And that's where the little green dots are. Okay, next slide. So what happens if the remedial action level for every single chemical that we care about, but in this example, we'll just use PCBs, we have 3 options. In the top option, you can dredge, and dredging means that you basically you're digging out the contamination from the mud. And in the bottom left-hand part, you could maybe dredge, or you could put some clean sand over the contamination, and that would protect ecology and people. And then there's something else called enhanced natural recovery, which is where you're capping, you're putting some sand over the contamination, the pollution, but it takes some time to recover. Next slide, please. So this is where we are today. Yay, finally. So we're in the RD, or remedial design, and just thinking about taking remedial action. So the remedial design is where we have to start thinking about just like, how do you figure out how much contamination is exactly where? So before in the ROD, we had an estimate, but now we're going to get more detailed and figure exactly where it is and how deep it is. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just a map reminding everyone what we're doing, because I look at the river and sometimes get confused about landmarks. So we're looking north, and we're looking at Harbor Island, which is used to be the second largest artificial island in the world. You can see the East Waterway right next to it, and you can see the Spokane Street Bridge, which is right underneath the West Seattle Freeway. And then farther, you go south, there's the Duwamish Longhouse. And then you go farther south, you can see South Park with the Duwamish Waterway Park, the First Ave South Bridge, T117 People's Park, and Jorgensen Forge. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a picture of the Lower Duwamish Waterway site, which is 5 miles long. And first of all, take a look at the picture on the left. And it's the Green River, and that the river's coming all the way from like Mount Rainier, and it's washing down beautiful, clean sediments down the river. And it's flowing north towards Elliott Bay. Now, we have made a decision, and it makes perfect sense, that you would divide the cleanup into 3 reaches. Well, what is a reach? A reach is really a section of the river where the conditions are similar, like in depth or their slopes. And so we're going to clean up the upper reach, the green part, first. And that is meant to, and that's because if you clean that part up first, then the clean sediments are mud that comes from upriver will then cover up that after the dredging, and then the middle reach gets cleaned up next, and then the lower reach is cleaned up finally. Okay, that's it for me, and I'm going to pass it on to James.
So Lynn, thank you very much. Just to start, we use this term remediate, and that's because EPA uses that term remediation. What that means is cleanup. It's just the term that EPA uses as cleanup. Now, what I would like to be able to go through is what are the what's the slides that we're going to see this Thursday or the 31st? And if we can go into the next slide, EPA is going to be talking about where are they on that upper reach, or what Lynn described as the green area. And then we're going to start the sampling process in the middle reach, which is the very next part downriver. And do we have any questions or concerns or ideas to propose to EPA? That's what we're trying to do in this meeting, is to make sure you're prepared for the meeting on Thursday, and that it all doesn't come at you at once and you can't even answer the questions or ask the questions. Next slide, Maggie. So again, we're looking at the three different reaches: the upper watershed, or the upper Duwamish, which is where we're dealing with, which is a little beyond the turning basin, all the way down to Duwamish Waterway Park. Then the middle reach, which is what we're just starting to look at now, is from Duwamish Waterway Park all the way down to Alaska Marine Lines. And then the lower reach, which is from Alaska Marine Lines past the Duwamish Longhouse to the south end of Harbor Island. And those are the three reaches that we're dealing. Next slide. So this gives you an idea of what we're talking about when we talk about the upper reach. And as you can see, it goes from Duwamish Waterway Park all the way up just above the turning basin and into Tukwila. Go ahead, Maggie. Now, in the upper reach, we've already done a series of tests with EPA and responsible parties. Responsible parties are the ones who are responsible for the cleanup. That means the Port of Seattle, King County, City of Seattle, and the Boeing Company. So they put together designs of testing, and then EPA agrees with that. Then EPA talks to us to make sure that it's all being done according to what the community wants, which is why we are doing these meetings now. Now, after we're done with the sampling testing, then the next is to actually start looking at the cleanup of the upper reach. How will it be cleaned up? Go ahead, Maggie. So in the upper reach, we're looking, as was said before, this is closer to the Green River. This is the upper part of the Duwamish. And early actions that have already been done here. The big one is Boeing Plant 2, took out an awful lot of chemicals. One we're working on finishing up right now is the Jorgensen Forge. And then one that was done actually before the Superfund site, which is Norfolk Outfall, which is right up in the turning basin. We've already had habitat restored, which EPA is going to be talking about. We call today Duwamish Waterway People's Park in South Park. And I was just there last week and it's starting to look really nice. Next slide. Now, the record of decision, and this is a slide that comes from the record of decision. That was back in 2014. Gives an idea of how these areas are going to be cleaned up. Now, we've gone through a lot of testing since that time with responsible parties and EPA, and we have looked at all of those tests and the results. And what it does is gives a really clear idea of what needs to be cleaned up and how does it need to be cleaned up. And so that's what we're looking at today or in the next upcoming meeting with EPA. But that's just the beginning of that process. I cannot tell you more that there is a way that EPA is going to be looking at each one of these cleanup areas as an individual cleanup area to make sure we have a plan specifically for that area. Next slide. Now, we're talking about the middle reach or the next reach lower in the Duwamish River from Duwamish Waterway Park all the way down to Alaska Marine Lines. Now, we're just now starting to schedule those cleanups. So schedule those testing. And that testing will, just like we have in the upper river, further define areas of contamination that need to be cleaned up, or as Lynn said earlier, that are above the remediation action level or the cleanup action level. And so that becomes really important to make the decision of exactly how we're going to clean up the middle reach. Next slide, Maggie. All right, we're to questions. And I hope that we have some people that have joined us on Facebook as well as others. And I am looking at a very, very good team that we have today, and we'll be able to answer those questions. Of course, we will be there on the 31st with you in the meeting. So if anybody has any questions that they might be afraid to ask, now is the time to ask them, because we want to make sure you're as prepared as possible. Thank you, Maggie.
Actually, we do have questions in the chat. So Maggie, were you gonna ask those first?
Yes.
I mean, they came in the Facebook Live. So
Yeah.
thank you for those questions, by the way.
All right. So one of the first questions we have, and this one will be going out to our staff here. Are there any plans to add 6 PPD? I'm not sure what that means, into the cleanup plan.
I can answer, well, I can sort of answer that question. First of all, for people who don't know what that is, it's basically a rubber additive that's added to tires. And so when it comes off of tires, it can then get into the streets and then run off like into rivers and it can be toxic to salmon. And I actually I can't remember whether it was ever tested for during the RI. So I would have to look that up.
Just to be able to kind of further answer that question, one of the reasons that we have a specific list of what we call contaminants of concern is that EPA has established that there's over 40 contaminants that are in the river that are above health standards. But if we take those specific contaminants of concern and look for those, if we clean those up, then all the other contaminants that we're worried about will probably be taken care of in that process. So that's one of the things that we look at as how EPA is approaching this.
Okay, awesome. Also, if folks want to follow up with James or Lynn, again, we will be listing our emails down below for any further explanation or conversations on these topics. The next question we have from one of our guests on Facebook is, how is the remediation method chosen? Are they all equal effective?
I can definitely try to answer that. Depending on, as Lynn had talked about in her presentation, there is a remedial action level. Now, that means that it's dirty enough that it really needs to be cleaned up. Now, below that, there are other methods that EPA is going to use to cover up the contamination because it's not quite as bad as needing to be cleaned up. Are all these different methods equal? I would say not. What we are going to try to push for, and something I think is very important in the process we are in right now, is if we have an opportunity to clean up just a little bit more, then maybe we'll actually have a better outcome as the cleanup of the river. And that's one of the things that we've heard from the community. And that's one of the things that we will continue to advocate for.
So I will just add that the remedial methods are considered in the feasibility study. And then the whole purpose of the cleanup plan or the ROD is the feasibility sort of gives all of these ideas for different alternatives and the costs. And there's a bunch of criteria about what you should follow in order to pick the most effective method. But dredging would probably be the most effective method, but sometimes it's outrageously expensive. So other criteria are decided on. And when you don't dredge and you decide to do something else, then you have to do something that's referred to as institutional controls. In other words, you have to monitor forever or until the contamination goes away. So some are more effective than others, but sometimes they're prohibitively expensive.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, James. We have a couple more questions that we have prepped here. One of them being, so I know we talked about this a little bit, but can we just recap a little bit on what are these pre-roundtable meetings for, and can anyone join us?
And I would be happy to answer that question because I'm kind of what we call the caucus lead. And the point of our caucus, or the Community Advisory Group caucus, is to invite anyone who wishes to attend the opportunity to prepare for what that EPA meeting is. In other words, go through the agenda, understand what it is, understand some of the questions before you get to the meeting. And we also do a post EPA roundtable meeting, so that if you don't think you had your questions answered, that we can still carry those questions forward for you. So we do the pre-meeting and we do the post-meeting, and those meetings are open to anyone.
Great, thank you, James. Moving forward, we have another question. This one's more about the roundtable, and I think, James, you might have touched a little bit about it, but who are all those people, those other people in the caucuses and that show up at the roundtable meetings? It seems like there are a lot of attorneys and consultants. How are they communicating with the EPA?
Again, I'll take a swipe at that first. Understand that each one of the responsible parties not only the four that I mentioned earlier, the Port of Seattle, the City of Seattle, King County, and the Boeing Company, which makes up what's called the Lower Duwamish Waterway Group, or the possible responsible parties. There are almost 100 other businesses and industries in the Duwamish Valley who are also possible responsible parties. And in a lot of those cases, they've hired attorneys and consultants to help guide them through this process as well. And so all of those people show up, especially for the roundtable meeting, just to be able to keep up on what's going on the river and how it affects their clients and the entities that they're representing.
Awesome. We do have also 2 more comments on Facebook from our guests. Some of them are clarifying questions. It is saying, I just joined in a few minutes late. Did I hear y'all say that EPA has agreed to go back to originally agreed on level of cleanup in the East Waterway?
No. EPA and responsible parties on the Duwamish Waterway or the Duwamish River cleanup have agreed to go back to the original levels of CPAHs, which was something that EPA put out months ago as an explanation of significant difference, that they didn't think that these contaminants were as bad now as they thought they were then. And so they've changed that to go back to the original on the Duwamish River cleanup. The East Waterway is right now still an unanswered question. We have not seen a proposed plan released for the East Waterway. And we're waiting to hear about that. And we've been working with all the different agencies in the state, as well as with Washington, D.C., to make sure that everybody understands our concerns of what we're looking at in the East Waterway.
Thank you, James, for the clarification. All right, another question we have here. How do we know that the locations where they have decided to take action are protective enough for humans and the environment?
So that's the most important part of this cleanup, is that how we actually make that definition of where to clean up and how much to clean up. We've worked with EPA very closely to make sure that they, kind of like when you're building a house, you want to measure twice before you cut once. And I think it's very important to understand that it's not just once, but it's twice, and now a third time that we're going to be going back and looking at testing and data to make sure we know exactly where the extent of the contamination is in the upper part of the Duwamish River. And we know how deep it is. And that will give us as the community an opportunity to ask that question. If you took another foot out, or another 1.5 feet, or whatever it is, as Lynn said, then you won't have to monitor it forever. It will be done. The river will be better for it. The community would be better for it. And so that's important for us to remember as we go through this roundtable process, that this is our opportunity to ask for as much as we can get.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you, James. Another question we have here is, if we truly want a clean river, where we can fish someday, why aren't we dredging more instead of capping?
I think that's the same answer that I just had. And I'll go a little bit further with that. We have a really good opportunity to have a really good cleanup on the Duwamish River. From when I started looking at the river almost 40 years ago, the river has improved immensely. And where we are right now in our cleanup is where other communities across the country have found themselves. And one of the things that we look at for other communities across the country is that they look back and wish that they had done more. Now, this is our opportunity to make sure that we can do as much as possible. And that's what we are going to be asking for. That's why we have the pre and post roundtable meetings, why we even recommend this kind of a process in the first place, so that the community is involved with all of the responsible parties and all of the agencies to look at how we're doing this cleanup and is it the best way we can do it.
Okay, thank you, James. All right, let's see how many more of these questions we have here. We are right on time. The next one I have for you, James or Lynn, any of you that could answer this, is about the cost. So when we think about cost of the cleanup, how much more does it cost to dredge versus placing a cap and then having to do long-term monitoring of caps?
One of the things that we found out, especially from one of our early action areas, is that one of the responsible parties, in particular the Boeing company, actually looked at it. And what they found is that it cost them an awful lot more to monitor a cap and in perpetuity or forever, as Lynn said, than to just take it out, take the contamination out. And that's one of the points as we move through this process that we're going to be making. Not only does it make sense as far as the health of the community around the river, but it makes financial sense as well. Boeing had a very big cleanup, almost a mile long on the river. There would have been a huge cap to monitor. But then we have a lot of smaller caps in the upper part of the cleanup in the Duwamish. How much is that going to cost to be able to monitor? And all of those things need to be balanced out because the port, the city, and the county are all us. The people in the Duwamish Valley are part of the city, we're part of the Port of Seattle, and we're part of King County. And so if it is cheaper and better for us to do it quicker, then let's do that.
One of the things to think about when we listen to Ellie on March 31st is there's some really, really tricky areas where we have to clean up the pollution. Some of them are under bridges or under riprap, which is like the rocks on the slope, or just under piers. And so, it's like, how do you go about doing cleanup around structures that might then fall down if you do too much cleanup of which you're not really careful. So that's something to be thinking about when we listen to Ellie on the 31st.
Thank you, Lynn. I think this next question kind of got answered a little bit, so I will go ahead and skip to the last one of the, not last ones, one of the other ones I have. So how clean is clean? And we hear this question a lot from community as well. When will we be able to fish in the river again?
I'll start, and then I hope Lynn will follow up with me, because she's actually the expert on this type of question. First of all, we or the community does not expect the river to be what it was 150 years ago. That is not going to happen just because of the environment around the river, including all of us people who live here. But can we get to a place to where, instead of not being able to fish at all for any of the fish who live in the river all year round, crabs, clams, flounder, perch, all of those things that people have fished for in the river, can we get it to a place to where you might be able to do it maybe 3 times a month or 4 times a month? Those are the type of simple goals that we're looking at, which is why the East Waterway cleanup is so important to us. That we have different standards for different parts of this river. And so what we want to have is one standard, and that standard is to be able to get to that place eventually where we can fish. Will we be able to fish all the time? Probably not. But will we be able to fish? That is the goal, that we will be able to fish in the river, and it will still be healthy for communities. Lynn, is there anything else you wanted to say?
You said it just about right, James. But the answer, but your question about when, Maggie, is good question. We don't know exactly when we will be able to start eating the resident fish regularly from the river again, but we have set this thing called a preliminary remediation goal. It's basically a goal that we're going to be able to eat them again someday, hopefully within the next, well, hopefully 3-ish years, which sounds crazy, that our kids will be 30 or older by the time we can eat the fish again.
But it's because of the actions that we're taking today, the involvement that we have today, that is going to guide that when we get to our children being in their 30s and their children to be able to enjoy fishing in the river again.
Yeah.
All right. We do have one more question on the chat, and it goes a little more towards the team, asking what can we do to help support DRCC at this meeting aside from showing up?
I'll leave that to our executive director.
I think that's a beautiful question. Thank you so much for asking. You know, we are going along with community, working really hard and making sure their voice is being heard. But of course, it's always very important that your own voice is being heard. So when there are meetings like the round table, it is important to us that you show up and you ask these questions yourself to EPA, and you bring up your own concerns, and you, of course, join the collective of all of us assuring that we are working towards water equity, health equity for our communities, and all the wonderful things that Lynn and James said, because we do have hopes that we will be able to swim, to fish, to enjoy our river. And we work with a lot of youth, and they all have said in the classes that we host with them, it's very hard to see a river that you cannot enjoy. And so we want to change that narrative, and we want to make sure our children that are growing will be able to enjoy a healthy river. So whenever coming up to the meetings is one great way. Following the work that we do, sometimes we invite too many meetings, and right now we have a new format of doing it virtually because we want to offer an opportunity for people to join from home. But also we host a lot of community events. So come and support those as well. We do cleanups. And then we have a petition going that I'm going to put the link in here. We still are hoping to deliver this with many signatures as we can. And if you live in the Seattle area, it's always very important to know the real history. And so coming to our boat tours or learning more and sharing with others is what we ask for sure. Thank you for that wonderful question.
Thank you, Paulina. All right, now it's time to kind of wrap things up. So we have a couple just questions, more questions, James, more questions, Lynn. I'm coming for y'all just to help us recap and understand clearly what we talked about this evening. So Paulina, if you could help me really quick sharing those questions.
I'm sorry, what do you need my help with?
Can you help me with the questions really quick?
Oh, yes, of course.
Thank you.
Okay, so very quickly, I think we covered today many different things, but let's do the quickie answers to wrap up our meeting in a summary. Why are we sampling and where? In 1 minute answers, let's go.
Less than 1 minute. We are sampling mostly in the upper third of the river, which is just south of the turning basin down to Duwamish Waterway Park. We've done 2 extra samples in that area, and we're going to do 1 more after that. And then we're just starting that process in the middle river, or the middle section of the river, which is from Duwamish Waterway Park all the way down to Alaska Marine Lines. And so that's the next start of the process. Who pay, or is it, did we ask who pays for that?
Yeah, who pays for that?
Responsible parties are the ones that pay for that. In our Superfund program, it is polluters pay, which means that those who are responsible for the pollution pay for the pollution. And so they're the ones that are paying. But remember, that is actually you and I, the city, the county, and the port. We are all part of that. So it is important that we have a say in how this is done.
Great, wonderful, James, thank you. And for Lynn, let's talk about the levels of CPAHs that we talk about. Would it make any changes for the sampling that are already done now with the new adoption of the CPAHs?
No, so the good news is that the sampling plans that have been happening for the past few years are going to stay exactly the same, because the remedial action levels, the RALs, are staying the same as in the ROD. So nothing has changed. They'll just keep on sampling the way that they were all along.
Great, thank you. And Rain, thank you for your comment about the good point that Lynn made about asking EPA about dredging around in water infrastructure like piers, bridge supports, docks, and walls. Is there anything else that you would like to say about that, Lynn?
No, except that it's a it's a really big important deal for Jorgensen Forge. A lot of the contamination is underneath the riprap and would be crazy expensive. It's a huge problem in the East Waterway. So and then it's going to be a big problem for the next reach, Mill Reach. So keep your eyes open and think about what this means for us and cleaning up the whole river and being able to eat the fish.
Wonderful. Maggie, do you want to ask the last question?
Sure, of course. Are we, all right, sorry folks, I kind of lost it a little bit, but are we talking about the CPAHs?
Yeah, we did that already. So if you want to grab another one.
All right, so I guess a good way to kind of end for today, and I think James, you might have touched a little bit on this, and also Paulina, can the community give input where to sample?
Always the community can put the whole idea of the roundtable process is the community can be involved in the process. And so if anybody in the community looking at all of the maps and everything else and realize that there's another place that has been missed, that is an important thing that we all need to hear. And so, yes, we are looking for those answers to the questions, or the questions that need to be answered. And so when we look at this, if there's something that has been missed, now is the most important time to please say something about that. Because no matter how much we look, there's something that might be left behind. And right now, we don't want to leave anything behind. So thank you for that, Maggie.
Awesome. Thank you, James. All right, so I think that is a wrap from us today in our pre-meeting. Thank you so much to the folks that joined us on Facebook, all those that put their comments, questions, and interacted with our video today. We're really happy we answered some of your questions. If you're still at home and you still have more concerns, or you're still asking yourself a couple of these questions, feel free to contact us. Emails are really simple currently for James at drcc.org, Paulina at drcc.org, and for myself, it's Maggie at drcc.org. Lynn, we will list yours as well, if that's okay with you. But remember, we have our actual EPA roundtable meeting March 31st. So if y'all can make it, if you have more questions about that, let us know, and we'll be happy to answer that for you. This recording will be stayed on Facebook and our website. So if you want to take a recap or just look it over again, you're more than welcome to. But other than that, thank you, James. Thank you, Lynn. And thank you, Paulina, for today.
Thank you, Maggie. Wonderful, always your support and your help. And all of you, thank you so much for being here with us. Have a rest of lovely evening with your family. Bye-bye.
Have a great one. Let me